Marcus Thompson had always been the kind of man who solved problems with his fists. At 28 years old, he stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and arms covered in tattoos that told stories of his rough past. Growing up in the poorest part of Chicago, he learned early that respect came through fear, and fear came through violence. His criminal record stretched back to his teenage years. Assault charges, battery cases, and countless bar fights had earned him a reputation on the streets. Marcus enjoyed that reputation. He liked the way people crossed the street when they saw him coming. He loved how conversation stopped when he entered a room. Power, even the crude kind that came from intimidation, was the only thing that made him feel important. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus woke up in his cramped apartment with a hangover and an eviction notice taped to his door. His unemployment benefits had run out weeks ago, and his last job at a construction site ended when he punched his supervisor over a disagreement about work hours. The bills were piling up, his girlfriend had left him the previous month, and his anger was reaching a boiling point. After drinking 3 cups of strong coffee and popping some pain pills for his headache, Marcus decided he needed to get out and find some action. He pulled on his leather jacket, the one with metal studs across the shoulders, and headed downtown. The city was bustling with its usual mix of business people, tourists, and street vendors. Marcus felt invisible among all these successful-looking people, and that invisibility made his anger burn even hotter. As he walked through the busy streets, Marcus noticed something that caught his attention. A group of tourists was gathering around what appeared to be some kind of historical reenactment. Men in elaborate uniforms with shiny buttons and ceremonial swords were standing at attention near the old courthouse building. These weren't just any costumes. They were detailed replicas of royal palace guards from centuries past, complete with tall black hats and red coats with gold trim. The event was part of the city's Heritage Week celebration. Local actors had been hired to portray various historical figures, and these palace guards were demonstrating traditional ceremonies from the colonial period. They stood perfectly still, their faces serious and professional, while a tour guide explained their role in protecting royalty during the 1700s. Marcus watched from across the street, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. These guys looked so clean, so proper, so different from everything he knew. Their uniforms were spotless, their posture perfect, and they carried themselves with a dignity that Marcus had never experienced in his own life. Something about their composed demeanor irritated him deeply. The lead guard, a man named David Richardson, was particularly impressive. At 35 years old, David had spent 12 years in the military before becoming a historical reenactor. He took his role seriously, studying the actual duties and protocols of palace guards from that era. His uniform fit perfectly, his boots were polished to a mirror shine, and he carried his ceremonial sword with the respect of someone who understood its historical significance. David had grown up very differently from Marcus. He came from a stable family, served his country with honor, and now worked as a high school history teacher during the regular school year. The reenactment work was his passion project, a way to bring history to life for others while earning some extra money during summer breaks. He believed deeply in showing respect for the traditions and sacrifices of those who came before. As Marcus continued watching, his resentment grew stronger. Here were these guys playing dress-up, getting attention and probably decent pay while he couldn't even make rent. They looked so confident, so sure of their place in the world. The crowd of tourists was taking pictures, asking questions, and treating these actors like they were genuinely important. Marcus felt a familiar surge of jealousy mixed with rage. The morning sun was getting higher, and more people were stopping to watch the demonstration. Children pointed at the guards' tall hats, couples took selfies with the historical display in the background, and elderly tourists shared stories about their own family's military history. The whole scene represented everything Marcus felt locked out of: community, respect, and legitimate purpose. Marcus crossed the street and moved closer to the group. He could hear David explaining the significance of the guards' morning inspection ritual to a family from out of state. The man's voice was clear and educated, and he answered every question with patience and detailed knowledge. This only made Marcus more angry. Here was someone who seemed to have it all figured out, someone who commanded respect without having to intimidate anyone. Standing just a few feet away from the display, Marcus began to formulate a plan, He didn't know exactly what he wanted to do, but he knew he wanted to disrupt this perfect little scene. He wanted to show these fancy dress-up soldiers that their ceremonies and traditions meant nothing against real street power. He wanted to prove that all their discipline and training couldn't stand up to raw aggression. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change both men's lives in ways neither could imagine. Marcus spent the next hour circling the demonstration area like a predator studying its prey. He watched how the guards moved, noted their routines, and looked for any sign of weakness. The more he observed, the more convinced he became that these men were just actors playing a role. Surely underneath those fancy uniforms, they were no different from anyone else, probably softer even, than the real fighters he knew from the streets. David Richardson continued his duties with professional dedication, unaware that he was being watched so intently. He led the changing of the guard ceremony, demonstrated proper sword handling techniques, and answered countless questions from curious visitors. His three fellow guards, Michael, Robert, and James, rotated through their positions with military precision, each man taking his role seriously despite the theatrical nature of their work. The crowd around the demonstration had grown to about 50 people by noon. Tour buses had stopped, local families had joined the gathering, and several news reporters were documenting the Heritage Week celebrations. The attention seemed to fuel Marcus's resentment even more. These guys were getting treated like celebrities just for wearing costumes and standing around looking important. Marcus noticed that David seemed to be the leader of the group. When tourists had questions, they directed them to him. When the other guards needed guidance about their positions or timing, they looked to David for signals. This made David the obvious target for Marcus's growing plan of disruption. As the demonstration continued, Marcus began to edge closer to the action. He pushed through the crowd using his size and intimidating presence to make people step aside. Some visitors gave him strange looks. His leather jacket and aggressive demeanor stood out sharply against the family-friendly atmosphere of the heritage celebration. But Marcus didn't care about fitting in. He had never fit in anywhere, and he wasn't about to start now. The breaking point came when a little girl, maybe 7 years old, approached David with wide eyes full of wonder. She asked if he was a real soldier, and David knelt down to her level to explain the difference between historical reenactors and actual military personnel. He spoke gently about how people long ago served their kings and queens, and how important it was to remember their service. The child listened with fascination, and her parents smiled appreciatively at David's kindness and patience. Watching this interaction sent Marcus over the edge. Here was this fake soldier getting praised for talking to a kid, receiving more respect and admiration in 5 minutes than Marcus had gotten in years. The unfairness of it all crashed over him like a wave. Why should this guy get to play hero when Marcus, who had fought real fights and survived real dangers on the streets, was treated like garbage by society? Marcus pushed forward more aggressively now, shoving past a teenage couple who were trying to take photos. The boy started to protest, but one look at Marcus's face and aggressive posture made him back down quickly. This small victory fed Marcus's confidence. He was remembering why he enjoyed intimidating people. It was one of the few ways he could feel powerful in a world that seemed designed to keep him powerless. David noticed the disturbance in the crowd and looked up to see what was causing the commotion. His military training had taught him to be aware of his surroundings, and something about Marcus's approach set off warning bells in his mind. The man moving through the crowd wasn't just another curious tourist. His body language was aggressive, his expression was hostile, and he seemed focused on disrupting the peaceful demonstration. The other guards noticed the tension building as well. Michael, who was standing at attention near the courthouse steps, caught David's eye and nodded slightly toward Marcus. Robert and James subtly shifted their positions, following protocols they had learned during their own military service. Even though this was supposed to be a harmless historical demonstration, their training kicked in when they sensed potential danger. Marcus finally reached the front of the crowd and stopped just a few feet from where David was standing. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more striking. David stood tall and composed in his pristine uniform, representing centuries of military tradition and honor. Marcus slouched in his worn leather jacket, representing the anger and frustration of someone who felt left behind by society. The tourists around them began to sense that something was wrong. Conversations died down. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people started reaching for their phones to record what they suspected might become an interesting confrontation. The peaceful atmosphere of the heritage celebration was about to be shattered by the collision of two very different worlds. David maintained his professional composure, but his eyes never left Marcus. Years of military experience had taught him to recognize genuine threats, and everything about this man's demeanor suggested trouble was coming. David's hand instinctively moved slightly closer to his ceremonial sword, not because he planned to use it as a weapon, but because touching it reminded him of the discipline and training that had carried him through dangerous situations before. Marcus stood there for a long moment, letting the tension build. He enjoyed the way the crowd was now focused on him instead of the guards. He liked seeing uncertainty replace the earlier atmosphere of pleasant curiosity. For the first time all day, Marcus felt like he had some control over the situation. He was no longer invisible. Everyone was watching him now, waiting to see what he would do next. The confrontation was about to begin, and neither man fully understood how drastically their lives were about to change. Marcus broke the tense silence with a loud, mocking laugh that cut through the quiet crowd like a knife. "Look at all these people getting excited over some guys playing dress-up," he announced loudly, his voice dripping with contempt. "What's next? Are we going to clap for the guy who flips burgers at McDonald's?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Parents began moving their children further back, while others pulled out their phones, sensing that something dramatic was about to unfold. The peaceful heritage demonstration was quickly transforming into something much more volatile. David remained calm and professional, though his jaw tightened slightly at the obvious provocation. "Sir, we're conducting a historical demonstration here," he said in a steady voice. "If you have questions about the colonial period or palace guard traditions, I'd be happy to answer them." This measured response only made Marcus angrier. He had expected the guard to either back down in fear or respond with matching aggression. Instead, David was treating him like just another curious tourist, which somehow felt more insulting than any direct confrontation would have been. "Historical demonstration?" Marcus stepped closer, now standing just arm's length from David. "You mean playing pretend like little kids? Except you're grown men running around in funny costumes, acting like you're important." His voice grew louder with each word, designed to humiliate David in front of the watching crowd. The other three guards maintained their positions but were clearly alert and ready to respond if the situation escalated. Michael's military experience in Afghanistan had taught him to recognize when someone was working themselves up to violence, and all the warning signs were flashing bright red with Marcus's behavior. David continued to project calm authority. "These uniforms represent the service and sacrifice of real soldiers from our nation's history," he explained patiently. "We're here to help people learn about and honor that tradition." "Honor?" Marcus practically spat the word. "You want to talk about honor? I've been in real fights, buddy. I've had my nose broken 3 times and put plenty of guys in the hospital. You're just some wannabe soldier playing games for tourists." The crowd was growing larger as word spread through the Heritage Festival that something dramatic was happening at the Palace Guard demonstration. People who had been visiting other historical displays were drawn by the commotion, creating a circle of spectators around the confrontation. Marcus fed off the attention. This was exactly what he had wanted, to be the center of everyone's focus, to prove his dominance over someone who seemed to represent everything he resented about society. He began to pace back and forth in front of David like a boxer trying to intimidate his opponent before a fight. "You know what I think?" Marcus continued, his voice now loud enough for everyone in the growing crowd to hear clearly. "I think you're nothing but a fake tough guy hiding behind a costume. I bet if we took away that fancy outfit and that toy sword, you'd run home crying to your mother." David's fellow guards exchanged glances. They could see that their leader was maintaining remarkable self-control, but they also knew that Marcus was deliberately trying to provoke a physical confrontation. Robert, who had served 2 tours in Iraq, subtly adjusted his position to provide better support if things went wrong. Several people in the crowd began urging Marcus to leave the guards alone, but their intervention only made him more determined to prove his point. "Oh, so now we've got fans defending the pretty boys in uniforms," he announced mockingly. "Maybe you all need to learn what real toughness looks like." David made one final attempt at de-escalation. "Sir, I understand you're upset about something, but this isn't the place to work out whatever problems you're dealing with. There are families with children here trying to enjoy a peaceful educational experience. That measured, almost counselor-like response was the final straw for Marcus. He interpreted David's continued calm as condescension, as if the guard thought he was too sophisticated to be bothered by some street thug's challenges. The rage that had been building all morning finally boiled over. "You think you're better than me?" Marcus shouted, stepping even closer until he was almost nose to nose with David. "You think that fancy uniform makes you some kind of hero? Let me show you what real fighting looks like." The crowd gasped and several people screamed as Marcus suddenly drew back his right fist and threw a wild haymaker punch aimed directly at David's face. It was the kind of street fighting move that had worked for Marcus countless times before in bar fights and alley confrontations. A sudden, brutal attack designed to end a fight before his opponent could react. But David Richardson was not a bar patron or an unprepared victim. His military training kicked in instantly. Time seemed to slow down as his combat reflexes, honed through years of discipline and practice, took over completely. Marcus's punch was telegraphed and clumsy, thrown by someone who relied more on size and intimidation than actual fighting skill. David saw it coming from the moment Marcus's shoulder began to shift, giving him precious milliseconds to react. What happened next would be talked about by witnesses for years to come, and the cell phone videos would eventually be viewed by millions of people online. The confrontation between the street thug and the palace guard was about to reach its explosive climax, and Marcus Thompson was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. David's response was lightning fast and devastatingly precise. As Marcus's wild punch came toward his face, David executed a perfect defensive maneuver he had learned during close-quarters combat training. He slipped his head to the left, letting Marcus's fist whistle harmlessly past his ear, while simultaneously stepping forward and inside Marcus's extended arm. The street thug's momentum carried him forward, leaving him completely off balance and exposed. David's counterattack was instant and brutal. His right fist, trained through countless hours of military conditioning, shot upward in a textbook uppercut that caught Marcus directly under the chin with the force of a sledgehammer. The impact was sickening. Marcus's head snapped back violently as David's knuckles connected with his jaw, and the crowd heard a distinct cracking sound that made several people wince and turn away. Marcus's eyes went wide with shock and pain as he felt his teeth collide with tremendous force, several of them breaking off at the roots. Blood immediately began flowing from Marcus's mouth as he staggered backward, his hands instinctively moving to his face. He could feel pieces of broken teeth on his tongue, and the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. The pain was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a sharp, stabbing agony that seemed to radiate through his entire skull. But David wasn't finished. His military training had taught him that in combat, you don't stop fighting until your opponent is completely neutralized. As Marcus stumbled backward, David followed up with a powerful left hook that caught the thug on the side of his jaw, spinning him around and sending more broken teeth flying in a spray of blood and saliva. Marcus crashed to the ground hard, his leather jacket scraping against the concrete as he rolled and clutched his face. The crowd gasped in shock and horror as they saw the extent of the damage. Blood was pouring from Marcus's mouth, and several of his front teeth were clearly missing completely while others hung loose and broken. David stood over his fallen opponent, his ceremonial uniform still perfectly neat despite the violent encounter. His breathing was controlled and steady, and his posture remained military straight. The transformation from peaceful historical demonstrator to combat-ready soldier had taken less than 3 seconds, and now he was calmly assessing the threat level to determine if further action was necessary. Marcus tried to get up, but immediately collapsed again as waves of pain and dizziness overwhelmed him. He spit out blood and what remained of 2 of his front teeth, the white enamel now stained red as they hit the pavement. The sound he tried to make came out as a gurgling moan because his mouth was so damaged he could barely form words. The other 3 guards quickly moved to surround the scene, creating a protective perimeter, while David continued to monitor Marcus for any sign that he might try to continue the fight. But it was clear that the confrontation was over. Marcus was in no condition to threaten anyone. He was too busy dealing with the overwhelming pain and trying to stop the bleeding. Several people in the crowd were already calling 911, while others held up their phones to record the aftermath of the brutal encounter. The videos would later show David standing calmly at attention, while Marcus writhed on the ground, blood pooling beneath his face as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened to him. "Someone get an ambulance," shouted a woman from the crowd. "That man needs medical attention right away." David nodded to Michael, who immediately began coordinating with the emergency responders who were being called to the scene. Years of military experience had taught all of them how to handle the aftermath of violence, secure the area, tend to any wounded, and prepare accurate reports for the authorities. Marcus finally managed to prop himself up on one elbow, his face a mess of blood and swelling. He looked up at David with a mixture of shock, rage, and something that might have been fear. This wasn't how street fights were supposed to go. He was used to his size and aggression intimidating people into backing down, or at worst, engaging in clumsy brawls where his experience gave him an advantage. But David Richardson had demonstrated a level of fighting skill that Marcus had never encountered before. Those weren't lucky punches. They were precise, devastating strikes delivered with professional competence by someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing. You broke my teeth," Marcus mumbled through his damaged mouth, the words barely intelligible due to his injuries. David looked down at him with neither sympathy nor satisfaction, just the calm assessment of a professional soldier who had dealt with a threat. "You threw the first punch," he stated simply. "I defended myself and protected the civilians in this area." The sound of sirens was growing closer as police cars and an ambulance rushed toward the scene. Within minutes, the peaceful heritage demonstration had become a crime scene, with Marcus Thompson learning the hardest lesson of his violent life. His reign of intimidation was over, ended by a man who proved that real strength comes not from aggression, but from discipline, training, and the courage to stand up for what's right. As Marcus lay there bleeding and broken, he began to realize that his assumptions about the palace guard had been catastrophically wrong. The police arrived within 4 minutes, followed closely by paramedics who immediately began treating Marcus's injuries. Officer Sarah Chen, a 10-year veteran of the force, took control of the scene while her partner began interviewing witnesses. The crowd of tourists and locals had grown to over 100 people, many of whom had captured portions of the confrontation on their phones. Marcus was conscious but clearly in severe pain as the paramedics worked on him. His mouth was so swollen and damaged that he could barely speak, blood continuously trickling down his chin despite their efforts to control the bleeding. 3 of his front teeth were completely gone, 2 more were hanging by threads, and his jaw was visibly swollen on both sides. "Sir, we need to get you to the hospital right away," the lead paramedic told Marcus as they prepared to load him onto a stretcher. "You've got significant dental trauma and possible jaw fractures. You're going to need immediate surgery." David Richardson stood nearby, still in his perfect palace guard uniform, speaking calmly with Officer Chen. His knuckles showed some minor scrapes from the impact, but otherwise he appeared completely uninjured and composed. Several witnesses had already confirmed to the police that Marcus had thrown the first punch, and that David had acted in clear self-defense. Suspect approached our demonstration area in an agitated state. David explained to the officer, his military training evident in the precise way he reported the incident. He made several threatening statements, moved into my personal space in an aggressive manner, and then threw a punch at my face without warning. I defended myself using minimal necessary force to neutralize the threat. Officer Chen nodded as she took notes. She had seen plenty of bar fights and street brawls during her career, but this situation was unusual. The victim was clearly the aggressor, and the person who had delivered the devastating counterattack was a clean-cut military veteran working as a historical educator. The evidence and witness statements all supported David's version of events completely. Marcus was loaded into the ambulance, still conscious but heavily medicated for pain. As they prepared to transport him to the emergency room, he caught sight of David through the ambulance's rear window. The palace guard was now answering questions from a news reporter who had arrived to cover the incident, his posture straight and his responses measured and professional. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Even through his haze of pain and medication, he had come here to humiliate someone he saw as a fake soldier, to prove his own toughness and dominance. Instead, he was being carted away in an ambulance with his face destroyed, while David Richardson looked like he could step right back into his historical demonstration without missing a beat. At the hospital emergency room, doctors confirmed what the paramedics had suspected. Marcus had suffered severe dental trauma, with multiple fractured and displaced teeth that would require extensive oral surgery. His jaw was badly bruised but not broken, though the swelling was so severe that he would be on a liquid diet for at least 2 weeks. "Mr. Thompson, you're looking at months of dental reconstruction," Dr. Martinez explained as she reviewed his x-rays. "We'll need to do emergency surgery tonight to stabilize the remaining damaged teeth and clean out the fragments. After the swelling goes down, you'll need to see an oral surgeon about implants or bridge work to replace what you've lost." The medical bills alone would cost Marcus more than $20,000, money he absolutely didn't have. His lack of insurance meant that he would be facing financial ruin on top of his physical injuries. The brief moment of rage that led him to attack David Richardson was going to cost him dearly for years to come. Meanwhile, back at the Heritage Festival, David and his fellow guards were speaking with detectives who had arrived to conduct a more thorough investigation. The cell phone videos from witnesses clearly showed the entire confrontation, leaving no doubt about who was the aggressor and who was acting in self-defense. Detective Rodriguez reviewed one of the clearest videos on a witness's phone, watching as Marcus threw his punch and David's devastating counterattack unfolded in slow motion. "That's some impressive defensive work," he commented to David. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" 12 years in the Army, David replied, "including 2 tours in Afghanistan and extensive close-quarters combat training. But I want to be clear. I only used the minimum force necessary to protect myself and the civilians around me. I had no choice but to respond when he attacked." The detective nodded. In his 15 years on the force, he had seen countless cases where someone picked a fight with the wrong person. But rarely had the outcome been this decisive, or the roles this clear-cut. Marcus Thompson had made the classic mistake of judging someone's fighting ability based on their appearance and profession. Word of the incident was already spreading through social media. The videos were being shared thousands of times with captions like "Thug learns hard lesson from Palace Guard" and "Don't judge a book by its cover." Local news stations were preparing stories about the confrontation, with most focusing on the dramatic contrast between the professional, disciplined military veteran and the aggressive street thug who had vastly underestimated his opponent. By evening, Marcus was out of surgery but facing a long and painful recovery. His mouth was wired partially shut. His face was grotesquely swollen, and the reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. He had lost his teeth, would face thousands of dollars in medical bills, and would likely be charged with assault once he was released from the hospital. David Richardson, meanwhile, had completed his shift at the Heritage Festival and was heading home to his family. The incident had lasted less than 30 seconds, but its consequences would ripple through both men's lives for months to come. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Marcus Thompson was released from the hospital, but his troubles were far from over. His face was still visibly swollen, and the gap where his front teeth used to be made him look like a completely different person. The confident, intimidating thug who had approached the Palace Guard demonstration was gone, replaced by someone who could barely speak clearly and was afraid to smile. The criminal charges came quickly. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh filed assault charges against Marcus, with the case strengthened by multiple witness accounts and clear video evidence showing him as the aggressor. His court-appointed lawyer, overworked and dealing with dozens of similar cases, advised Marcus that his best option was to plead guilty and hope for a lenient sentence. "The videos show you throwing the first punch at a man who was just doing his job," Attorney Mike Stevens explained. During their brief meeting, "You've got multiple priors for assault and battery, and this time you picked on someone who turned out to be a decorated military veteran. The judge is not going to be sympathetic." Marcus sat in the lawyer's office, still struggling to speak clearly due to his dental injuries. The temporary partial denture the hospital had given him was uncomfortable and made him lisp. Every word reminded him of what David Richardson had done to his face, but he was beginning to understand that the blame lay entirely with his own poor decisions. The court hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after the incident. Marcus would face up to 2 years in jail for assault, plus substantial fines and court costs. His already precarious financial situation was becoming desperate. He couldn't work construction jobs while his mouth healed. His unemployment benefits had expired and the medical bills were piling up. Meanwhile, David Richardson had become something of a local celebrity. The news coverage of the incident had portrayed him as a hero who stood up to a bully, and his historical reenactment group was receiving more bookings than they could handle. Schools were requesting educational visits, and the Heritage Society had asked him to lead a new program about military history. But David took no pleasure in Marcus's suffering. During an interview with the local newspaper, he reflected thoughtfully on the incident. "I don't celebrate what happened that day," he said. "I did what I had to do to protect myself and the people around me. But I wish Mr. Thompson had made different choices. Violence should always be a last resort." The video clips from the confrontation had gone viral on social media, accumulating millions of views across various platforms. Most of the comments were supportive of David and critical of Marcus, but the overwhelming attention made David uncomfortable. He had never sought fame, and he worried that the incident was being sensationalized for entertainment, rather than treated as a serious lesson about consequences. As Marcus prepared for his court appearance, he was forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about his life, sitting in his apartment with a mouthful of temporary dental work and facing possible jail time. He had plenty of time to think about the choices that had led him to this point. His history of solving problems with violence had finally backfired catastrophically. For years, he had relied on intimidation and aggression because they seemed to work in his limited environment. But when he encountered someone with real training and discipline, his crude approach had failed completely. The medical bills were crushing him financially. The emergency surgery alone had cost $12,000, and the oral surgeon estimated that proper dental reconstruction would require another $15,000 minimum. Marcus's credit was already destroyed, and no payment plan would make these costs manageable on his non-existent income. The social consequences were almost as devastating as the financial ones. The viral videos had made Marcus's face recognizable to thousands of people in the city. Whenever he went out in public, people would point and whisper, recognizing him as the thug who got his teeth knocked out by the palace guard. The humiliation was constant and inescapable. His few remaining friends from his street days weren't supportive either. In their harsh world, getting dominated so completely by someone they saw as a fancy dress-up soldier was viewed as weakness. Marcus found himself isolated, with his reputation for toughness completely destroyed by 30 seconds of viral video. The job search was equally hopeless. Construction foremen who might have overlooked his criminal record in the past were now aware of the Palace Guard incident, thanks to the widespread news coverage. No one wanted to hire someone famous for picking fights and losing badly, especially someone who might attract negative attention to their business. As his court date approached, Marcus was forced to consider the possibility that his entire life needed to change. The aggressive, intimidating persona he had cultivated for so many years had finally led him to disaster. David Richardson had shown him that real strength came from discipline and training, not from bullying and violence. The question now was whether Marcus could learn from this devastating lesson, or if he would continue down the same destructive path that had already cost him his teeth, his reputation, and possibly his freedom. The Palace Guard incident had ended in less than a minute, but its impact on both men's lives was just beginning to unfold. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, both men were living vastly different lives shaped by that brief but explosive encounter at the Heritage Festival. Marcus Thompson stood before Judge Rebecca Martinez for sentencing, his appearance dramatically altered from the confident thug who had once terrorized bar patrons and construction sites. The dental reconstruction had partially restored his smile, but the work was incomplete due to his financial limitations. More importantly, something fundamental had changed in his demeanor. The swagger and aggressive posture were gone, replaced by a quiet humility that surprised everyone who had known him before. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Martinez said as she reviewed his case file, "you have an extensive history of violent behavior, and this incident represents a pattern of poor decision-making that could have seriously injured an innocent person. However, I've also received some interesting information about changes in your life since this assault occurred." Marcus's court-appointed attorney had submitted letters from an unexpected source, the community center where Marcus had been volunteering for the past 3 months. Unable to find work due to his notoriety and criminal record, Marcus had initially started volunteering simply to have somewhere to go during the day. But something unexpected had happened during his time there. Working with at-risk youth who reminded him of his younger self, Marcus had begun to see the destructive path he had been following. These kids were making the same mistakes he had made, choosing violence and intimidation over education and legitimate achievement. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus found himself in a position where he could actually help people instead of hurting them. The community center director, Mrs. Williams, has written that you've been working with young people who are struggling with anger management issues, the judge continued. She says you've become one of their most effective volunteers because you can speak to them about the real consequences of violence from personal experience. Marcus nodded, still struggling slightly with his speech due to his dental work. Yes, Your Honor. I've been trying to show these kids that the tough guy act doesn't work in the real world. I learned that lesson the hard way when I met someone who had real training and discipline. The judge considered this for a long moment. Marcus's transformation wasn't just talk. The community center had documented his consistent attendance, his positive impact on the youth programs, and his genuine commitment to making amends for his past behavior. Several of the teenagers he had been mentoring had even written letters to the court describing how his honest account of his failures had helped them make better choices. Mr. Thompson, I'm sentencing you to 18 months in county jail, with the possibility of work release after 6 months if you continue your community service and complete anger management counseling. Additionally, you'll serve 2 years of supervised probation and pay full restitution for any medical expenses incurred by Mr. Richardson, though I understand he has declined to press for those payments. Marcus accepted the sentence without complaint. He knew he was getting a lighter punishment than his record would normally warrant, and he was genuinely grateful for the opportunity to continue working with the kids at the community center through the work release program. Meanwhile, David Richardson's life had taken an unexpectedly positive turn. The publicity from the incident had led to opportunities he never could have imagined. The History Channel had hired him as a consultant for a documentary series about military traditions, and he had been invited to speak at schools and military bases across the country about leadership and conflict resolution. But perhaps most importantly, David had used his newfound platform to promote a message that went far beyond self-defense techniques. He spoke frequently about the importance of discipline, education, and finding positive ways to channel aggression and frustration. That day at the Heritage Festival could have been avoided if Mr. Thompson had found healthier ways to deal with his anger and frustration, David explained during a television interview. Military training isn't just about fighting, it's about discipline, respect, and protecting others. I hope people understand that violence should never be the first choice, but sometimes good people have to be prepared to defend themselves and innocent bystanders. The most surprising development came 8 months after the incident, when Marcus Thompson requested a meeting with David Richardson through their respective attorneys. Marcus had been released on work release and was continuing his community service, but he felt he needed to face the man whose life he had tried to disrupt. They met at the community center where Marcus volunteered, surrounded by the teenagers he had been mentoring. David was impressed by the genuine change he saw in Marcus. The aggressive thug had been replaced by someone who was clearly working hard to build a better life. I owe you an apology, Marcus said, his reconstructed teeth still slightly noticeable when he spoke. I came at you that day looking for trouble because I was angry at my own failures. You were just doing your job trying to educate people and honor history. I had no right to attack you. David listened carefully, then extended his hand. I accept your apology, Marcus. What you're doing now with these kids, that takes real courage. It's harder to admit your mistakes and work to fix them than it is to keep making the same bad choices. The two men shook hands, and David agreed to visit the community center occasionally, to speak to Marcus's youth group about military service, discipline, and making positive life choices. Their unlikely partnership became a powerful example for the at-risk teenagers, showing them that people could change and that former enemies could become allies in fighting the cycle of violence that trapped so many young people. The viral video of their confrontation was still circulating online, but now it served a different purpose. Instead of just being entertainment, it had become a teaching tool used by counselors, social workers, and youth mentors to demonstrate the real consequences of violence and the possibility of redemption. Marcus never fully recovered from the financial and social consequences of that 30-second confrontation, But he had discovered something more valuable than money or reputation, a sense of purpose and the respect that comes from helping others avoid the mistakes he had made. David Richardson continued his historical reenactment work, but he was now recognized as much more than just a palace guard actor. He had become a symbol of how proper training, discipline, and moral courage could triumph over mindless aggression. And his story inspired countless others to choose education and service over violence and intimidation. Both men learned that a single moment of poor judgment could change everything, but they also discovered that redemption was possible for those willing to do the hard work of becoming better people. The thug who struck the palace guard had indeed lost his teeth in brutal payback, but in the end both men found something more valuable than what they had lost: the opportunity to make a positive difference in the world.